Welcome back. Dr. JC here, Lecture 13, Part 2. And in this part, we're going to move beyond that Renaissance period, that period of rebirth, and we're going to talk about this Reformation, also known as a Protestant Reformation. Roots of those words are protest and reform. This is going to deal directly with the Catholic Church and the power of the Catholic Church. We'll also take a couple minutes at the end of this part to talk about this larger Baroque period too and what that means as well, all right? So over the course of the next several minutes, we'll take a look at religious disturbances in Europe, the creation of all sorts of new different Christian denominations, which is part of this Protestant Reformation, and we'll also talk about this Baroque period as well. From a time standpoint, we're talking about roughly around 1517, so early 1500s to the middle of the 1600s, of 1648. In fact, if you were to ask someone to bookend this period known as the Protestant Reformation, they would say that it would start with Martin Luther's 95 Thesis in 15 and 17, and it would end with these religious wars or the Treaty of Westphalia in 16 and 48, which ended these 30 Years' Wars. So we're talking about roughly 1517 to 1648. Just as the Renaissance had an impact on the individual, I mentioned it also had an impact on kings and queens. And kings and queens during this time period, this Reformation period, also known as this period the Age of Absolutism. And it's called that because kings and queens are looking to establish absolute authority. And in order to have absolute authority, you need to make yourself superior to the Bishop of Rome or Pope. Even beyond the differences that kings and queens try to establish here with the Catholic Church, there's going to be other individuals that start to question the Catholic Church, its principles, its dogma, its doctrine. And some of this is a natural byproduct of Gutenberg's printing press. With Gutenberg's printing press, more people could read the Bible, more people could read, more people could question why. And as more people read the Bible, they would start to have their own interpretations. It's what's known in the theological world as one's hermeneutics, how one interprets religious texts. So not only do you have kings and queens now looking to try to set themselves apart from the Catholic Church, you have other average everyday citizens, you have religious or spiritual leaders that are starting to call into question the Catholic Church as well. And let's not forget that other elephant in the room here, the Black Death. How did people view their religious leaders of the Catholic Church in the wake of that turmoil? They lost some faith there. And as a result of that, people begin to scrutinize what the Catholic Church was doing. And this is going to have an impact during this time period, as we'll see. Among the several areas that people would begin to scrutinize the Catholic Church, 3 of them are listed here. We'll start with the second one first because this was a little bit more doctrinal than it was per se a practice, all right? The Catholic Church has long, and still does, subscribe to and prescribe 7 sacraments. And I'm not going to get into each of these 7 sacraments here. They're listed here. Those who are interested, you can research that further. But there will start to be individuals that read the Bible themselves and say, well, wait a minute, where in the Bible are these 7 sacraments? There aren't. In fact, there's only 2. Those 2 being baptism and Eucharist. So where are these other 5 coming from? Are these like money-making deal for the church here? What do we got going on? The other 2 I've listed here are indulgences and relics, and both of these are tied together with one another. We'll take indulgences first. Indulgences was a way for the Catholic Church to perhaps raise some extra revenue, raise some funds for the church. And Catholics believe that there's this sort of stopover place between one's earthly existence and one's eternal existence called purgatory. And if your soul departs and it's not entirely pure, you're going to spend some time in purgatory where you will be purged and made clean and whole, and then you can go on to the land of milk and honey, fully purged, fully healthy in soul. And these indulgences in some ways were, I don't want to say a get out of purgatory free card, because that's a little bit too simplistic, but I think that makes the point. That Catholic priests would go about various towns selling these indulgences. So imagine for a minute you have some poor old widow, she's getting ready to perhaps meet her maker. She only has a few pennies left in her pocket, so she decides to go ahead and buy this indulgence from the Catholic priest. may be well-intentioned to be sure, but what did the Catholic Church do with those revenues? Well, this is where relics come into play. Rather than use those funds for more humanitarian means, say funding Habitat for Humanity, Meals on Wheels, helping those that are less fortunate, the Catholic Church decided to go ahead and commission stonemasons to add to the great cathedrals that were there. So you can see in some ways where the Catholic Church is opening themselves up here to much criticism. Over time, these practices are going to be called into question. They're going to be challenged. And now Martin Luther is not the first to call for reform within the Catholic Church, but he will be the one that we remember most because he went ahead and just listed all the things that he thought the Catholic Church needed to work on. The 95 Theses are really 95 points that Martin Luther called into question as it relates to church practice and or church doctrine or dogma. For example, the sale of indulgences. This is one of the first things that Martin Luther is going to go after. He's going to say, look, where does the Pope have any authority over purgatory? Right, this is insane. Or as an example of church doctrine here, as much as practice, Martin Luther is going to call into question this merit or order of saints that the Catholic Church has, because he says, look, there's nowhere in the Bible does it call for this. So this stuff is all man-made. It's not God-made. Therefore, I have a problem with this. Rather than detail the fight between Martin Luther and Pope Leo that's going to take place here, and they are going to have a cage match of sorts, which is not going to end up well for the Catholic Church, I do want you to remember that this 95 Thesis really does start this Protestant Reformation. And I do want you to remember the roots of the words here, protest and reform, because we're not entirely sure that Martin Luther had it in his mind that he wanted to blow up the Catholic Church. He actually wanted to reform it. There is one difference, however, that I would call particular attention, and that is Martin Luther's concept of free grace, because this is different. In Catholic Church practice, if somebody had sins, you would go to confession to confess those sins to a priest. The priest would then give you some sort of penance, usually in the form of Our Fathers and Hail Marys, prayers that you would say, and then you'd be forgiven. Martin Luther said that's crazy. You don't need that. The Bible here says in the book of Romans, the just shall live by faith. By faith. I don't need to go to some Catholic priest if I'm like feeling poorly about something I did. If I have a truly repentant heart, I can, on my own, talk to God or nature's God directly and ask for forgiveness. I'm given free grace. I don't need the Catholic Church to get to heaven. I can get to heaven there myself. Think about that. Because if you go way back to our previous lecture when we were talking about unum sanctum, where Pope Boniface, before he got himself arrested by Philip, he had declared that what? Only the Catholic Church, only the Pope could guarantee an individual could get into heaven. And this is a far cry from that. And in a way, it reflects this spirit of the Renaissance. The individual matters. Well, an individual here can have a relationship with that Most High God too, if he or she desires to. And they don't need the Catholic Church for that. So it's an important point of separation to be sure, and one for you to consider. As is the case with most revolts, and the Catholic Church viewed this as a revolt, not all leaders of the quote-unquote revolt are going to agree with one another. And in some ways, this is no different than what happens here in the Reformation. Not everybody's going to buy exactly what Martin Luther has to say. There'll be others that come up with their messages. Others that want to break from the Catholic Church but don't necessarily agree with Luther, so therefore they start their own denomination. And that's where we eventually come up through this spiritual or religious split with so many different denominations within the Christian world. Yes, you have Catholics and then we have Protestants, but underneath that larger Protestant umbrella, as many of you may well know and some of you may practice, we have what? Episcopalians, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans. I'll stop there. We could keep going on. All Christian equally alike, but these different Christian denominations, all underneath the Protestant Reformation, all have their taproot in 15 and 17 largely, and Martin Luther's 95 Thesis. Before talking about this important council that the Catholic Church is going to call, known as the Council of Trent, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that not all aspects of the Reformation were spiritual per se. The English Reformation is a great example of that. Henry VIII was King of England at the time, and he was looking for a way out of his first marriage with Catherine of Aragon. And whether he wanted to trade her in, she was an older model, for something young and new like Anne Boleyn, who would wind up being his second, and not his last. In fact, there'll be 6 wives of Henry VIII, for those interested in reading more about it. But he's looking for a way out of this marriage, and he wanted a divorce. The only one that can sanction a divorce for the king is the Pope. The Pope would not give him a divorce, so he just went ahead and said, well, I'm king, and I'm going to go ahead and, during this spiritual insurrection that's going on, I'm going to break from the Catholic Church too. We'll create a new church. We'll call it the Anglican Church, or Church of England. And one of the first things I'll do then is give myself a divorce. So sometimes that old adage does apply. It's good to be king, I think, unless you're Catherine of Aragon. Then it really sucks, right? Whether or not Henry VIII ever winds up any happier, probably not, because he's going to go through 6 iterations of wives, right? And again, those interested read about it. It's kind of interesting. It really is. But the main takeaway here is that not all of these Protestant reformations, not all these Protestant denominations that are going to emerge during this Protestant Reformation were born out of spiritual differences or doctrinal differences with the Catholic Church. Some of them were just circumstances that individuals tried to use for their own gain, such as Henry VIII here. If you're Pope Paul III, at this point you don't really care why people are breaking away from the Catholic Church, other than the fact that they are. And it's time to apply a tourniquet. We've got to stop the bleeding here. And Pope Paul III then will call for this Council of Trent. He's going to call for religious leaders in the Catholic Church to meet in Trent and begin what historians refer to as the Catholic Counter-Reformation. This is where the Catholic Church is going to say, you know what, we're going to pony up, we're going to recognize that we do have some problems, let's fix them. While Pope Paul will initiate this, the council's actually going to go on for almost 20 years, from 1545 to 1563, and there will actually be 3 popes. You can start with Pope Paul here, then you'll have Pope Julius, and finally Pope Pius. And it'll be under Pope Pius's reign then, in 1563, that the Catholic Church finally does establish a common sort of doctrine that would be considered maybe more people or parishioner friendly. And because of this Council of Trent, because the Catholic Church has recognized, yeah, maybe there were some things here we were doing from an administrative standpoint that weren't necessarily right, a large amount of Europe's population that still wanted to be Catholic was much more comfortable in their decision of remaining Catholic rather than going over to some of the various Protestant groups that were emerging. So in that essence, it really was a tourniquet of sorts. And this Catholic Counter-Reformation was really impactful because it did save at least half of Europe to the Catholic Church. Before moving briefly into an introduction to this Baroque period, and I'll apologize, I'm biased. I love the Baroque period and I just kind of want to plug it in here. I did want to do a quick review of the Reformation. A couple salient points for you guys to take away. First, Martin Luther, 95 Thesis, boom, Catholic Church. Catholic Church is going to ultimately respond. How? With a Catholic Counter-Reformation in the form of this Council of Trent. They will eventually get their house in order. That said, the Christian world will be split. You'll have Catholics and Protestants now, and underneath those Protestants, all sorts of different denominations. So let's pivot to this Baroque period. The Baroque period itself, as shown here, roughly 1600 to 1760, it's a cool bridge, I think, between the Renaissance and Reformation and then this scientific revolution and enlightenment that's going to come behind it. And we'll talk about that scientific revolution and enlightenment in future lectures. It's also during this Baroque period that we see some timeless art produced. We see the emergence of monarchs like Frederick the Great, shown here, the great military leader from Prussia, who was known to be a great concert flutist. Again, this sort of warrior philosopher, this idea of a Renaissance man of action, and how kings are as impacted by this individual movement as much as average everyday people are. So it truly is a bridge between all these periods. And it's a bridge that gives us such timeless works as individuals such as those depicted here in their Baroque music. Good luck going to a wedding today without hearing Pachelbel's Canon in D, right? Or to a library or art gallery where we can't appreciate Shakespeare or Rembrandt. So as they say, auf Wiedersehen. Check out the Baroque period.